Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chantal Chagnon, and I am the CEO for the Green Party Calgary Centre. I'd like to thank you all for attending this evening. It's going to be a wonderful conversation. It's an amazing opportunity to find out what's happening with our democratic system. Calgary is an amazing place because we are such an incredible city. The Green Party sees us and sees the future here. So next year, in August, we will be hosting the Federal Green Party Convention here in Calgary. And now I would like to introduce someone special. For anyone who was following the exciting by-election, you may have heard of him, or anybody who likes to read, you may have heard of him as well. Chris Turner is an incredible man. He's an inspiring author who makes us think and makes us believe that we can change the world one step at a time. And so, without further ado, I would like to introduce Chris Turner.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks. First of all, this is just such a tremendous turnout, in the midst of a municipal campaign, in the midst of, a time when maybe our attention isn't entirely on federal politics. Such a wonderful turnout. So thank you all, first of all, for coming. It's a great honor to be here and to be part of this Save Democracy from Politics tour stop here in Calgary. I'm going to start with a little bit of a story of my own, and then I will get to our guest of honor and let her take over for the rest of the evening. But first, a little story of my own. And it's about the thing I've been doing since a number of you joined me on what was a tremendously inspiring by-election campaign. Did lead to the best result the Greens have ever had in Alberta. A little bit short of where we'll get to next time. But I really do appreciate the chance to talk to you about what I've been doing since. And it was something I actually started before I ran for office, which is now a book called The War on Science. And I think gets to the core, and in stores this Thursday, by the way, if not already, makes a wonderful gift, all that. Anyway, the core of the book begins from the idea that we have moved into some pretty strange, uncharted territory in Canadian politics. And the way I think of it is I think about my Uncle Ron. And now my family's, on my mother's side, we're originally from Nova Scotia, huge old Catholic family. My mother's got 9 brothers and sisters. Uncle Ron has always been, maybe my personal favorite. He's sort of the family historian. He's a great storyteller. He can tell you, stand in the middle of the woods outside of Antigonish, Nova Scotia and say, okay, this used to be a town site, and then they moved it 10 kilometers down the line, and just an amazing storyteller. He's also a very, very typical kind of old guard Nova Scotia conservative. And he and I have, tremendous political debates, and have for years, since I was old enough basically to hold my own with him, or at least attempt to. He was a career Army officer, very, very active in his church. Probably thought, particularly when I was in my late teens, early 20s, that I was getting maybe a little too wild for him. But I eventually, came back to a place where we could have great conversations. And the great thing about talking to Uncle Ron is we could disagree like cats and dogs about what the right versus left, the best direction for this or that. But if we were talking about something and there was a fact or a collection of facts, a study, a scientific, an established scientific pool of research, and we were getting into it, and you could say, well, actually, if you look at the research, if you've heard about the science, if you look at the facts of it, here is a document that you can refer to. That is where the debate reached its outer limit with a guy like my Uncle Ron. You weren't allowed to say, that doesn't matter. You weren't allowed to say that if in fact those facts are inconvenient for what we are doing policy-wise, let's just throw them out the window. Let's in fact figure out a way to dismantle the entire apparatus by which we as a government gather those facts in order to make it easier for us to keep doing what we want to do policy-wise. And that is the terrain I think we now find ourselves in politically, where wherever you are on the political spectrum, left, right, center, green, liberal, even old conservative, you're now seeing a government that has lost all tether to what used to be the great Canadian tradition of democracy and science in the public interest and public policy making based on evidence. And when I'm not doing all this political stuff, I spend a lot of my time meeting with people who run companies, meeting with business organizations, governmental organizations, that sort of thing. And again, wherever we are in the political spectrum, we can all agree that we need a government that has recourse to facts, that builds its policy based on the best available evidence. That is what, if you run a business, you expect your government to do. If you get into a place where you need information to know whether this is a safe place to conduct your business, or what the impact's going to be of the thing you're going to do, or what sort of skilled workers you need in the regional talent pool in order to be able to build that business in that region, who is supposed to gather that evidence? The government of Canada is supposed to gather that evidence, and we did it magnificently for well over a century. This is one of the great traditions. We had one of the most outstanding, widely admired civil services in the democratic world. And in particular, we did. And in particular, we had government scientists who were doing absolutely groundbreaking stuff on a whole bunch of levels. We had a great statistics bureau. We basically invented a lot of modern environmental legislation for the entire world. We did all this with a beautifully run, really, really well-funded, arm's-length team of government researchers and scientists. And what the War on Science is about is really how I got involved in politics, which was to witness in terrifying fast forward the dismantling of that century of tradition. And really the only reason I got a good look at it was because so much of it was buried in this omnibus budget bill a year and a half ago that would have gone by without a trace. The other major political parties in opposition were far too interested in scoring political points with their bases to actually pay close attention. But there was one MP who basically single-handedly restored my faith in Parliament and inspired me to run, and that, of course, was Elizabeth May. And that is the reason. Thanks. And that is the reason we are all here today. I didn't run for Parliament because I always wanted to be an MP. I didn't run for Parliament because I always believed that the Green Party was the only political brand that could ever do the thing that it could do. I ran for Parliament because I saw one MP do something that told me, you can make a difference. You can get involved in this. You can, if not change policy tomorrow, change the way we think about government, change the way we talk about key issues, restore some actual dignity to what should be the great house of debate where we decide what is our common future together as Canadians. That has been so thoroughly debased that it almost sounds like a punchline at this point, that could possibly be the place where our highest level of debate occurred, but that is what that institution is for. It is an institution under grave attack. One of the few reasons I remain faithful that it has not gone past any kind of salvation is that the MP for Saanich Gulf Islands, the first Canadian MP from the Green Party in its history, is there in her seat every single day doing her job. I will now hand the mic over to Elizabeth May.
Thanks to Chris, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. And also, anybody here a parishioner of this beautiful Scarborough United Church? Just curious. Such a lovely, lovely space, and we had a great gathering here during the by-election campaign for Turner. We had some musicians rocking it out on stage. We had David Suzuki. This is not that kind of event. This is what I call a town hall. This is not even a partisan event. It's not about the Green Party. It's about democracy and about the threats to democracy. So as you can see from the signs everywhere, this is my Save Democracy from Politics tour. And some people have a hard time with, well, what does that mean? How can you isn't politics part of democracy? How can you save democracy from politics? How is there a threat to democracy? So let me explain a little bit of why the tour is about saving or rescuing democracy from politics. By this, I don't mean political activism. I love political activism. I consider myself, in that small p sense, a political activist from the moment when I was a small child and my mother told me I should not eat the snow because of atmospheric nuclear weapons testing and it contains strontium-90, and I would tell the other children on the playground that they should not eat the snow that contained the strontium-90. As you can imagine, their parents only warned them about the yellow snow. But anyway, I was always like a politically aware person, and that kind of political awareness is a good thing. And I was aware of what the toxicity within democracy was when I first joined the Green Party, which, by the way, I joined the Green Party because I decided I had to run for leader, because I'd just seen Stephen Harper and the Conservatives form a minority government and immediately start canceling our commitments under global climate action. And I thought, this is going to take becoming partisan. Although I don't like partisan politics very much, I'm going to have to do it because from an environmental group, perch, I will never be able to say the things I need to say about what's happening to public policy. I'm going to need to become partisan in a way I have never been before. So I'm essentially a non-partisan person. I'd never belonged to a political party before, and when I got involved with the Green Party, it was because I felt we had to ensure that real issues were debated in a way that was consistent to truth and authentic, and not about trying to spin something to constantly promote the advantage of one party over the other. Now, since I became a member of Parliament, which is the single largest honor I've ever experienced, and a real joy. I love being a member of Parliament. I love representing my constituents. And I hold town hall meetings like this in 8 to 9 locations in my riding twice a year to go out and hear what the people in my community think I should know about, to share with them what I've been doing on their behalf and get their comments. So I really love being a member of Parliament. But the exposure up close and personal to the dismantling of all of our Westminster parliamentary traditions and institutions. I want to say that again. I've been a personal witness the dismantling of all of our parliamentary traditions and institutions. There is an assault on all of our parliamentary traditions and institutions. And if we were in a war, people would know about it. You'd see people signing up to protect democracy. Other generations did that. But we stand at risk of losing democracy without a shot being fired, because the threat to democracy, back to the title of this tour, is partisan political parties and their excessive levels of power. The system of sort of a team mentality of constant hyper-partisanship at all times, whether we're in an election or not, is actually a threat to the functioning of our system. So let's step back and talk about democracy for a bit. Democracy, we all know its cradle was ancient Greece, and in Athens we had the first democracy thousands of years ago. Admittedly, not a perfect democracy. Women couldn't vote, slaves couldn't vote. But the essence of it was, if you lived in community and you decided collectively we needed to look out for each other and run things collectively, then everybody was involved. Everybody was a participant. It was a matter of duty as well as something that was a part of the fabric of life. Pericles in ancient Athens said, "A man who does not participate in the life of the city, we do not think lives at all." So it wasn't just a matter of, okay, a democracy is you can vote to change whoever's in government at the time. It was actually an aspect of your day-to-day life was to participate in the life of your community, and it was experienced not only as a political reality, but as a social reality, a cultural reality. It was part of your identity to be a citizen, to take an interest, to actually have power in that community to determine what direction it would take. So, you fast forward through a lot of the evolution of Westminster parliamentary democracy. Yes, okay, origins of democracy are ancient Greece. There's a fairly pivotal moment on the fields of Runnymede for Westminster parliamentary democracy when King John found himself faced with a lot of very angry nobles and otherwise commoners who in 1215 told him he had no right to make decisions about taxing their estates or making decisions as a king, mind you, that the monarch had no right to do these things without consultation with the commoners. That's why I serve in something called the House of Commons, with the vestiges of these ancient fights over, yeah, we're in a democracy, yes, we're in a constitutional monarchy. We understand that in a titular sense, our head of state is Queen Elizabeth across the ocean. But in a real sense, we have a democracy. But the establishment of the supremacy of Parliament came about at a time when a king was really a king, right? The monarch was a monarch. And you had these upstart commoners saying, wait a minute, no, you don't get away with that. And when King Charles, in the British Civil War, King Charles actually suspended the operations of Parliament. Sound familiar? King Charles suspended the operations of Parliament, for which he was beheaded. Right? I'm not... No, I mean, I may have to familiarize all of you with one of the core green values, which is nonviolence. But it's instructive to see what's happening to democracy when you consider that Westminster parliamentary democracy has always stood for some of the basic precepts of democracy from other places in the world. Now, of course, when you think of Westminster parliamentary democracy, one immediately thinks of, at least I do, of Winston Churchill and his great line that democracy is the worst system of government that's ever been tried, except all the others. It's true, democracy is hard. It's hard work. It isn't easy to maintain a healthy democracy. It's one of the ironies that was pointed out by a British professor in political science, Anthony Giddens, when he gave the prestigious British Wraith lectures about more than a decade ago, was this great irony that while much of the world is yearning for democracy, prepared to risk lives, when you think about the Afghan voters who have a purple finger when they go to vote in Afghanistan, and the Taliban say, we're going to target anyone with a purple finger and kill them if we find they voted. Or the people in Zimbabwe who'd escaped Mugabe and gone across the crocodile-infested Limpopo River to be refugees, and came back across the crocodile-infested Limpopo River because they wanted to vote against Mugabe. I mean, there are people in the 21st century planet Earth who risk their lives every time they go to vote. And as Professor Geddes pointed out, there's a very large irony here. As those people who live in the most established, long-standing democracies of the industrialized world show, at least in Canada, the US, and the UK particularly, countries which also share an unfortunate voting system of first past the post, which I think is a big part of why the populations in Canada, the US, and the UK are less engaged in the life of their democracy than in other places. But the democracy that we experience in Canada, the US, and the UK, as Professor Giddens said, here we have this irony where they're yearning for democracy in so much of the world, but here where we have the rights to express it, the rights to organize, free speech, and all the traditions of our democratic systems, we are the peoples of the world who are the most disillusioned, the least engaged, and the most cynical. So there's something to be concerned about there. Now, in terms of why I felt it was important to go out on the road and talk about democracy, is that we have this quite fragile system of Westminster parliamentary democracy. I say it's fragile because it was not forged through revolution. You look south of the border, and unfortunately, I think a lot of our misapprehension about the system of parliament and government that we have is because we are so informed by US political culture. We tend to forget, for instance, that we do not elect a prime minister in Canada. We don't. That we elect, in the last election, 308 MPs. In the next election, 338 MPs. And under our Constitution, it would be perfectly legitimate and legal if all the MPs were to assemble in the House after the election, and look around the room, much as the group of us here tonight, and say, okay, who wants to be Prime Minister? Who thinks they'd be good at it? Who do we know among us who would be, for instance, good at forging consensus? Somebody who's a good team player, someone who plays well with others. Under those kinds of assessments of who would be a good Prime Minister, we probably wouldn't pick most of the people we've had in recent years. The reason we don't think about who would be a good Prime Minister is because it's decided for us by a completely extra-constitutional, in other words, not part of our Constitution, not required for the Westminster parliamentary system, the rise of well-organized, well-financed political parties. That's why we don't wonder who's going to be Prime Minister at the end of the election. We have a dysfunctional voting system which says first past the post, whoever has the most votes per riding is going to send an MP. So you can have a situation such as the 2011 election where, sadly, only 60% of Canadians voted. And of the 60% who voted, 39% voted for Conservative candidates. And that was enough to form a majority government. And the reason we didn't wonder who would be Prime Minister at the end of that was that the Conservative Party in their convention had chosen their leader. Just as we wouldn't have been surprised if the Liberal Party had won the most seats, the Liberal leader was already selected through their process. So the overlay of political parties on top of Westminster parliamentary democracy is something that we take for granted. And I think it's worth every now and then recognizing it's an invention that isn't an inherent part of our system. The Constitution of Canada, whether you go back to the British North America Act or the modernized Constitution post repatriation to Canada, none of the Canadian constitutions in any version have ever mentioned political parties. It's not part of our system. It's not a required part of our system, although it's clearly, on a day-to-day basis, running the show. Another really interesting thing when you think about it is that another thing that isn't mentioned in our Constitution is the Prime Minister's office. The Prime Minister's barely mentioned, but the Prime Minister's office isn't mentioned. And it has become, first incrementally and creeping growth of power in the Prime Minister's office, dating back to Pierre Trudeau, who was the first Prime Minister who decided there was such a thing. And we don't question this very much, right? The US, as I said, they had their revolution, they formed a constitution, and the people who wrote the US Constitution were very concerned about abuse of power by those with access to it. So they created, as we see right now in the US where the government's shut down, they created a system of checks and balances. A president in the United States, Barack Obama or any other president, is in the executive branch, and under their constitution, there are checks and balances so that that person in the White House cannot exert total power, or even, if the Congress and Senate are differently minded, very much power at all. They have checks and balances, they have separation of powers. Under Westminster parliamentary democracy, there is no separation between executive and legislative. There is the Parliament of Canada, and the Parliament of Canada is supreme. The Prime Minister reports to Parliament, not the other way around. That's how our system is supposed to work. But the fragility of our system is that because we decided back in 1776 that we weren't going to sign up for George Washington's war. I mean, it was an open question. Some Nova Scotians contacted the Congress of the initial Congress of Revolutionaries and said, the Continental Congress, and said, can we join up? We'd like to take on King George II. It's quite an interesting history, really, and it probably wasn't a majority of Nova Scotians, and George Washington wrote back and said, sorry, we can't stretch ourselves that far north. And in any case, most people living in what is now Canada were loyalists. We were loyal to King George III. The entire graduating class of Harvard University in 1776 moved to what is now Canada. So we were we were, we thought, okay, King George is a little off his head. We get it. But really, our system of Westminster parliamentary democracy works well for us, and we won't have a revolution. So over the years, and of course it's more than just a few years, from 1776 to 2013, and certainly from 1867, when Canada became a full nation with a Westminster parliamentary system of governance, we have had a system that rested on respect for tradition. As a matter of fact, the only check against abuse of power has been the self-restraint of those with the opportunity to abuse power. The system that we enjoy, once a party in power has a majority of the seats, is that majority gives them total control over the executive and the legislative with no checks and balances. We don't think about this very much, but it came into sharp focus when in 2008, Stephen Harper decided to prorogue Parliament and shut it down in order to avoid a confidence vote that he knew he was going to lose. That was a rupture, an extraordinary rupture with all of our tradition and our understanding of what Westminster parliamentary democracy is supposed to be. Every political scientist of any note in this country has said that that decision was unconstitutional. But the problem with our fragile democratic system in Westminster parliamentary democracy is that it can be unconstitutional without being illegal. And if a prime minister is bold enough and ruthless enough, there's almost nothing to restrain that abuse of power. Just to illustrate the point, let me think, if you think back to Paul Martin in 2005, Liberal minority government, parallel to Stephen Harper in 2008, Conservative minority government. In 2005, I think it was about early to mid-November, the Conservative Party, the NDP, and the Bloc Québécois, one might call it an opposition coalition, but the Conservatives, the NDP, and the Bloc collectively told Paul Martin, if you don't bring down your own government in January, we're going to have a vote of no confidence and bring your government down, they were very precise, on November 28th. So Paul Martin was facing a certainty of the end of his government by a parliamentary vote on Monday, November 28th, 2005. Now, since we've seen Stephen Harper prorogue twice ways that were unconstitutional, the current prorogation is constitutional. I can explain why later if anyone's interested. But having seen prorogation happen, and then Dalton McGuinty followed what Harper did, so now we've had 3 unconstitutional prorogations in Canada since 2008. And by the way, none in the rest of the British Commonwealth. You can search everywhere through the Commonwealth with systems of government like ours, and the only example of a prime minister shutting down Parliament to avoid either political embarrassment or a vote they thought they would lose is Canada. There was one prime minister in Sri Lanka who tried it, and the Governor General said no. So the only examples of this kind of egregious abuse of power are from Canada. So we're kind of used to the idea of prorogation. So when I ask you the question, like, so why didn't Paul Martin decide to prorogue to avoid the confidence vote he knew he was going to lose? Now, I've never actually asked Paul Martin the question, but I'm pretty certain that if I did, the answer would have been it never occurred to him, because it simply isn't done. That's how fragile our democracy is in Westminster tradition, that the things that you wouldn't do that aren't legal, that have never happened before, are because it simply isn't done. Another example is that, and we have a lot of conversation right now about the Senate. I never minded the Senate until recently, because those unelected senators knew one thing. They knew they lacked the legitimacy. Even though they had the power on paper, they knew they lacked the legitimacy to vote down a bill that had been passed by the democratically elected, legitimate House of Commons. So until Stephen Harper appointed enough Conservative senators who would do what he said on instruction, we had had no examples in the history of this country of a bill being defeated in the Senate before it even went to a committee for study. Not until and it was when, of course, the Conservatives still had a minority of the seats, and it was during the time that Michael Ignatieff was Liberal leader. It took a while to get him back on the right side of this issue. But the Parliament of Canada passed a bill put forward by what was then a New Democratic Party member. He's now an independent, named Bruce Heyer, Bill C-311, a Climate Change Accountability Act. That bill passed the House of Commons. And when it went to the Senate, which is generally doing, as we know, sober second thought, pro forma hearings, inquiring whether the bill could be improved, but what happened to that bill was a scandal. It absolutely rocks the foundation of who we are and how Westminster parliamentary democracy is supposed to work, because Stephen Harper had instructed the Conservative senators, at your first opportunity, kill that bill. It's the first time ever that a bill has been defeated in the Senate that was never sent to a committee for study in the Senate. It was killed at their first opportunity. That rupture also should have registered much more loudly than it did. So what I've seen since I became a member of Parliament, and the things, my last book was this one, which was about Canadian democracy, losing confidence, power politics, the crisis in Canadian democracy. And I wrote about the dysfunctionality of our electoral system. I wrote about the crisis that we have, a huge chunk of the Canadian public deciding they'd rather not vote at all than get involved. But what I've seen as a member of Parliament, and certainly what's happened since Stephen Harper's party obtained a majority of the seats, is that what was once a sort of a creeping threat to democracy is now a galloping threat to democracy. The Prime Minister's office has a level of power and control which violates every principle of good governance. It's an outrage. Now, Chris talked earlier about his new book, The War on Science. I should back up and say that in the 1980s, and I never knew how lucky it was for me that this happened to me in my life. I was recruited by a progressive conservative environment minister. I wasn't a member of that party, but I was an environmental activist, and the Minister of Environment decided that, and I was an environmental lawyer, he dragged me into his office, and I really wasn't all that keen, but he talked me into it. And I worked for the Minister of Environment between 1986 and 1988, when the Mulroney Conservatives had a majority of the seats. And I will be grateful to my dying day that I had that opportunity. Because what it means is that right now in the House of Commons, I'm one of the only members of Parliament who remembers what Parliament is like when it works properly. For instance, when I was in Ottawa 86 to 88 working in the Mulroney government, I should say Mulroney administration, that's one of the mistakes we make that drives me crazy, and I just let myself do it, is that we do not have a government with the name of the Prime Minister. It's the Canadian government. Now, it's not Stephen Harper's government. It was never Mulroney's government. In any case, I worked in the Mulroney administration, and the legislation that we put forward at first reading that went to committees was always amended. Bills would go to committee, and then Liberals and New Democrats would say, I'd like to propose this idea or that idea. And the Conservative members of Parliament in the committee would say, well, that's a good idea. And my boss would say, in the case of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, the act was virtually overhauled by opposition amendments in committee that made it a better bill. Right? So there was cooperation, there was give and take. Bills were always amended in committee. Now, under Stephen Harper, especially now since he's had a majority, Chris talked about Bill C-38, an egregious piece of legislation, destroying, amending, repealing, or creating 70 different pieces of legislation in 440 pages. And that bill, between first reading and royal assent, did not have a single semicolon changed. Even the places where they found drafting errors, they wouldn't correct them. Because the system has become so partisan that they believe that any change to legislation is like a political defeat. This is completely craziness. Amending legislation is what Parliament's supposed to do. MPs are supposed to go. It used to be the case that parliamentary committees were largely nonpartisan. People would just sort of check their partisanship at the door, go in there and work together to get better legislation. The toxicity of hyper-partisanship has now completely contaminated the process within committees. Another place that things have changed dramatically since Stephen Harper got the majority of seats is the treatment of our nonpartisan professional civil service. They are under assault at all times if the partisan shop, being the Prime Minister's office, thinks that they need to be bullied, suppressed, muzzled, whatever. The fundamental principle that the civil service is nonpartisan, that they are there to provide the best possible evidence to the elected folks. The elected folks are not required to take the evidence from the nonpartisan folks, but they are not allowed to instruct the professional civil service to invent fake evidence to justify their political decisions. Not until recently. So we've moved from a Canadian tradition of evidence-based decision-making to what we have now, which is decision-based evidence-making. It is exactly Queen of Hearts, verdict first, evidence later. It's extremely dangerous. Now, I could give you many more examples, but I want to wrap up and open the floor to questions. The reason I'm going across the country talking about this is not to tell you that Stephen Harper shouldn't be Prime Minister. That, of course, I think is the case. He shouldn't be Prime Minister. But the reason I'm going across the country is this. When Ned Franks, I mentioned there's a lot of political scientists who have trouble with Stephen Harper. The second time that Stephen Harper prorogued on New Year's Eve of 2009, Ned Franks, who's professor emeritus at Queen's University, said, from now on, we should refer to Stephen Harper as King Stephen I of Canada, because he's exercising royal prerogative in ways that even a king didn't get away with in previous eras. But anyway, so my concern is this. If Justin Trudeau, whom I like a lot, or Tom Mulcair, were to become Prime Minister, I don't want them to be King Justin or King Thomas either. We have to dismantle this unholy level of total power that now resides within the Prime Minister's office. We no longer even have real cabinet government. A former progressive conservative senator who just retired, who was once in the Prime Minister's office with Brian Mulroney, a senator named Lowell Murray, earlier this fall, September 11th of this year, wrote a column in the Globe and Mail that was practically channeling the things I wanted to share with Canadians from coast to coast. He described what's happened to the loss of cabinet government. And what he said is that what's happened under Stephen Harper is that on top of what was already growing in centralized power since Trudeau, steadily every prime minister making it more powerful, the Prime Minister's office, he said on top of that existing PMO centralized system, Harper has imposed a tightly run communications regime within which message control is the very essence of governance. Under this system, even strong ministers often become passengers on their own departmental ships, their destination and course set by remote control from Message Central, capital M, capital C, at PCO, which stands for Privy Council Office, and PMO, Prime Minister's Office. Parliament is not even in the picture. At its worst, the system makes ciphers of ministers, reducing from substantive to symbolic the autonomy, authority, and accountability they should exercise. This is what's happening. We will now, whenever, and the history tells us anything, is that every prime minister consolidates the power they find in the Prime Minister's office and then expands it. And I don't think, if we don't have a public debate and a public demand before the next election, pushing the Liberals, pushing the New Democrats, and pushing the Conservatives, what will you do to restore parliamentary democracy, accountability, transparency, the legitimacy of evidence-based decision-making, the fundamental principle that the public purse is in control of Parliament? When I say they've gone after evidence-based decision-making, I don't just mean science and environmental issues. They're pulling out all of the fundamental pillars of evidence-based decision-making, even as it pertains to fiscal policy and a budget. Kevin Page, the parliamentary budget officer, said this as he resigned and retired. He said, look, Kevin Page said, every parliamentary institution is under assault, and parliamentarians simply do not have enough information to pass a budget. That's the truth, and that's a scandal. So going across the country, I'm just trying to reach out to as many Canadians as I possibly can to say, before the next election, we have to make sure, since the Canadian media isn't going to do it, We have to make sure that political parties of all stripes have to answer some tough questions so that when they walk into the Prime Minister's office, whether it's a Justin Trudeau or a Tom Mulcair or a Jason Kenney or whoever it is, and even if it's me, I don't want a Queen Elizabeth of Canada either, we have to ensure that the centralized power sitting on it's like a console with all the levers. Muzzle the scientists, muzzle the MPs, bully people, shut it down, change policy, eliminate evidence. Do everything possible for the sole purpose of maintaining power through spin and manipulation. That console that sits on a Prime Minister's desk has to be removed, dismantled, and smashed to bits. And it won't happen without your help. Thanks for coming tonight, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
I've never come across any literature that would speculate about why the Governor General permitted the prorogation of Parliament that first time. And I don't want you on the media. I don't want you becoming a front page headline, but I wouldn't mind your perspective.
Okay. I'm happy to answer the question. I could have it wrong, but I've talked to people who were in touch with the constitutional law experts who were advising her. Sadly, tragically, I don't think she had a choice because of some mistakes made by the opposition leaders in the lead up to this. And I was part of the conversation. I mean, as soon as Jim Flaherty put out the idea that we were going to be running multiple surpluses over many years and there'd be no economic stimulus package and all the going after the per vote subsidy, that was all on a Wednesday night. And I found out about it in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, from the media, and I immediately started phoning that night to Stéphane Dion's chief of staff, to Jack Layton's chief of staff, to Giuseppe, saying, this is crazy, we're going to have to do something, maybe we should form a coalition. I'm not saying it was my idea, but I know I called everybody Wednesday night. Thursday we were talking through the day. Gilles Giuseppe and I were trying to convince Dion and Layton, we got to bring down the government. There's a confidence vote on Friday. So the very next day there's a confidence vote, but it was on the speech from the throne. And Jack Layton and Gilles Giuseppe, Jack Layton and Stéphane Dion disagreed with Gilles Giuseppe and me. I mean, I haven't talked about this publicly, but we were discussing over the phone. I wasn't in the same place with them, but we were back and forth on the phone all the time. And Jack Layton and Stéphane Dion, the Liberals and the NDP, made a decision that they needed time to discuss how a coalition would work. They weren't prepared to vote no confidence till they'd figured out how this would work, and that they figured they had all weekend because they could put a confidence vote on for the following week. Steph and Gilles Giuseppe and I are saying, no, got to bring them down on Friday. Bring them down tomorrow. You can sort out the details later. I found out, and I certainly can't claim that either Gilles Giuseppe or I had thought through this next piece, but what did happen, as far as I understand it, is that constitutional law experts advised Michaëlle Jean that she could not deny Stephen Harper prorogation because he had just cleared a confidence vote. He had the confidence of the House because, as you know, Stéphane Dion told me at the time, this is just a procedural thing. No one thinks a speech from the throne confidence vote is a big deal. It's not like a budget. It's just pro forma. We're going to vote for that, and then we can move on from there. And that was, I think, a fatal mistake. Now, why Michaëlle Jean gave Harper prorogation on the New Year's Eve 2009 when he didn't even bother visiting Rita Hall but phoned her, I don't understand why that happened at all. But I struggled with it. I've heard many different theories of why she agreed to prorogation. The other thing, of course, was that she said, that influenced her apparently, was the commitment from Harper that the House would resume by late January. So in late November, she was giving him till late January, which also meant she was giving the opposition parties till late January. And there are a lot of tragic moments, as I see it, for Canadian democracy in this story. And one of them was that the Liberal Party allowed Stéphane Dion resigned because of the bad video. I don't know how many of you remember all these details and the kind of excruciating detail, but And then somehow Michael Ignatieff managed to become leader of the Liberal Party without a convention or a vote. And he had committed to following through with the negotiated coalition agreement, and then became leader of the Liberal Party and said, I'm not going to do it. Now, I think that was a fundamental betrayal of trust, and of course it's one of the reasons that I experience it every day in the Commons. Trying to get the Liberals and the New Democrats to work together, it's really hard, and one of the reasons is the NDP are still angry at the Liberals for reneging on the agreement that they'd negotiated in 2008. So there's ancestral hatreds between those particular groups, but that sure didn't help. So in Michaëlle Jean's defense, she didn't have a lot of choice, but the thing is, no prime minister should have asked for that. That's what we tend not to look at, is that the protections of Westminster parliamentary democracy rest in prime ministers who have the potential for ultimate power and control, recognizing, as I think Paul Martin would have, it simply isn't done. But when you have someone who's prepared to wreck absolutely all of our previous traditions, then anything becomes possible, which means ruthlessness and abuse of power could become the norm. Anyway, that's it. Gordon.
I don't know how well this is known outside Calgary, but right before Nenshi was elected mayor, there was a poll showing the three top candidates neck and neck, and I think that destroyed the problem of strategic voting. I was wondering if there's any way of trying to use polling, instant runoff polling, as a way of accomplishing sort of an instant runoff vote, and even having Green candidates step down if they don't come first in the poll. Because I know polls aren't as good as voting, but I think maybe an instant runoff poll might be superior to a first past the post election.
Let's face it, anything's superior to a first past the post election. But the problem with polls is they can be really wrong. And I would rather see that we ban polls. We have far too much polling as far as I'm concerned. If we didn't have any polls at all, you wouldn't have people constantly trying to guess which way things were going. If we had, I think the ideal voting system would be some form of proportional representation. I'd like to, the Green position is that we should not allow, and this is done in many countries around the world, the UK, Brazil, Germany, Belgium. No political party should be able to advertise buying TV ad time or radio ad time. And that would get rid of the use of advertising for what is essentially voter suppression. Really nasty attack ads are a form of voter suppression. So to clean up our election process, if we had only political candidates getting free airtime, advertising, getting the message across on TV is a good idea, but if you take out the manipulation in these ads where people have the ominous voiceover, right, whatever it is for whatever party it is, and the personal attacks, it's really hard to ban attack ads because that's a question of degree. How much is that an attack ad? How much is it ad hominem? How much is it fair comment? If you just say, look, you can't advertise on TV and radio and assault people's senses in their homes, you still have, the Brits still have really nasty billboards, but it doesn't quite assault you during dinner time or when you're watching the Grey Cup. So the last point is, if then on top of that, you also had to get rid of first past the post, have proportional representation, and you don't have the time contaminated with attack ads, and you don't have polling, so people actually start focusing on the issues and voting what they're for. Now, in the absence of all of that, I know people look at polls and decide, I'm going to pull out or not. And that's a tough choice for candidates. Just to finish off on this point, because it may not come up again in the town hall, the Green Party is committed in the next election and has made this offer to the other parties that we would cooperate in all kinds of ways to ensure that whatever group of parties or coalition of parties or single party gets elected has made a strong commitment, a binding commitment to get rid of first past the post. So one-time only electoral cooperation with the goal of bringing in a good voting system. Now, if all that fails, Gord, you're probably right, but how do you create the climate in which people are at all prepared to say, I'm stepping aside for someone else based on a poll? That kind of discussion needs to start a long time ahead of the election, and I think polls are a pretty precarious way to judge how things are really going.
I'm just trying to say, if there's a solution within the Green Party itself, then it's doable, whereas if it counts on cooperation from other parties, it's really hard.
If you have to have a solution that requires the cooperation of other parties, that becomes really difficult. And if the Green Party does it by itself, it becomes more doable. That's true. And I and the Green Party Federal Council that actually runs the party are always struggling with what we would do. I shouldn't say obviously, we believe it is essential for Canadian democracy that we have more Greens in Parliament, because it's the only way to prove to the Canadian public and to other parties that members of Parliament should work for their constituents, and that this nonsense of everybody reading from the same script, voting the same way, slavish adherence to message discipline, if we can break that down by example, it will be very healthy for all the other parties too. So we really believe we need, for the good of the country, to get at least 12 Greens elected in the next election campaign. If every other party's idea of cooperation is the Greens should go away, that's not going to work for us. But we're probably going to be willing to do much more to assist other good candidates in other ridings where we know we don't have, a targeted effort to elect a Green. So that's probably what we're going to have to do. Thanks. Sorry for long answers. I'll try to give shorter answers. I'm sorry about that.
I met you 2 years ago at the Hayes Breakfast with a lawyer. My name is Oscar. I watched you on TV today, and I have watched you on the House of Commons too. You do speak the truth, that's what I'm saying. But how do you fix it? We don't have a democracy anymore. I studied world history. We have a dictatorship globally now. You can't change it unless you go to court. But the court is part of the whole system already. So how do you change it? It's so hard. It doesn't matter how much money we're going to spend. We're living like the Roman Empire days, something tomorrow right now. But I like to get your feeling on to what I said. I've met Brian Maroney, I've met Gretchen, I've met Harper and Paul Martin. And, I've talked to them too. And I've met your leaders too. But, how do you get across to get accountability, common sense, ethics, and be responsible to taxpayers? How would you approach it from what you said? My feeling is we've got to change the whole system, or not unless we have a collapse, nothing will change. How do you feel?
Yeah. Well, Oscar, you're more pessimistic. I'm not so pessimistic. We still have a democracy, but the reality is we're living in a dictatorship. So how did that happen? If we have more members of Parliament who are, and you're right that the whole world has difficulties in governance, but let's focus on where we live and what we can do. If we had members of Parliament who were not being threatened, one of the things we could do is get rid of the leader's signature requirement on the nomination papers. So that right now, leaders of political parties in Canada, the biggest club with which they can threaten the people in their party is to say, I won't sign your nomination papers next time. Now, this is an Election Act change that was made in the late 1960s. It was because they added the political party name to the ballot next to the candidate's name. Up till then, we didn't have that. We just had the names of the candidates, no reference to their parties. It's the law of unintended consequences. Nobody thought when they changed the Elections Act that they were going to create leaders of political parties with this despotic level of control over everybody else in the party, because they could say, if you don't do what I say, you won't be able to run next time. So we could get rid of that. We could actually get rid of the Prime Minister's office and the excess power it has just by cutting its budget. It has $10 million a year, and this is purely partisan operatives with no accountability, no transparency. So how do we fix it? Well, we could actually fix it within Canada by having enough MPs elected who want to make the system work, because enough Canadians are engaged with their country and engaged with saving democracy that we don't sit back and wait for somebody else to do it. So a lot of this falls back on us as citizens to stop thinking of ourselves as consumers and realize, okay, if we're going to have a system that we can respect, we have to exercise a lot more engagement with it and demand more of the people who come asking for our vote. There's some structural things we can change, but the biggest thing is cultural. The biggest thing is recognizing that democracy is at risk, and if we want to make sure that the policies put forward by the Government of Canada are for the benefit of the people of Canada and not for foreign corporations, right now I would say that the overwhelming beneficiary of the current policies of the current administration are in the interest of multinational corporations and not in the interest of Canadians. So, but I would also say it's not a rigged game. We can fix it if we elect people who understand that their job is to work for Canadians and for our kids and grandkids. Our job as MPs is not to be toadies for a different agenda. We can do it, but it will take a lot more Canadians being a lot more willing to get into the process of picking candidates, vetting candidates, talking about politics, engaged in democracy as they did in ancient Greece. Every single day, it's part of what it takes to live and breathe. It's one of Maud Barlow's great lines that I love. She talks about a lady who said to her once, who was a woman in her 80s, who said, "Yes, dear," and I think what she was saying is citizen activism, not democracy, but they're very close. She said, "Citizen activism is just like having a bath every day. If you don't do it, very soon you will stink." So you're like,
my question is actually pretty similar to the previous gentleman's. How do we make these changes when the only people with the power to change them are the people who have the least reason to want to change them?
elections are useful for this. If you think about in 2015, well, number one, I think it's at least 50-50 that Stephen Harper won't be leading the Conservative Party by the next election. So I say that based on the level of discontent I see within the ranks of Conservative members of Parliament. But whether Stephen Harper or a different Conservative, Justin Trudeau's, the polling numbers look like things are in flux. It's a very good time to get commitments from people in politics when they want the vote. So I'm saying this not as leader of the Green Party, but as a citizen activist. I want to get on the record from Justin Trudeau and Tom Mulcair that they will remove the requirement from a leader's signature. That's not on the nomination papers. That's not going to happen if it's not an election issue and there's a substantial part of the Canadian public that says, I care about that. It's pretty arcane, right? How many Canadians think, oh gosh, the future of democracy is going to depend on taking away the leader's signature on the nomination papers for candidates? Most people don't think about it very much. It's the only weapon that the leader of a party has to really discipline a member of Parliament. The other thing we can do, as I said, is get a commitment that they're going to dismantle the Prime Minister's office. The best way to do that is to get them to commit to a budget figure that's a lot lower than what they currently spend. There's other aspects. Respect for Parliament. The public purse goes, Kevin Page, I mentioned him before, as Parliamentary Budget Officer, his first address after leaving PBO was actually a Green Party-sponsored event at the University of Victoria. And he said his two key messages were we have to restore evidence-based decision-making, and we have to restore the principle that the public purse is the purview of Parliament. We have to actually push back against contempt of Parliament. So the more that Canadians know that these are live issues that affect what kind of decision-making we get, whether the government of the day is working in our interests or in the interests of somebody else, whether it's the common good versus private wealth, we have to actually have people engaged on these issues. And I think writing letters to the editor about these things as it strikes you is very helpful because it makes other Canadians more aware of it. Letters to Mulcair and Trudeau, particularly for those of you who've been involved in those parties, to say, I want to make sure that if you become Prime Minister, you're not going to do the same thing Stephen Harper has done with abusing the civil service, trespassing on what is the usually non-partisan professional civil service advice. We have to ensure that parliamentary committees are empowered to review legislation, make amendments, and so that returning and restoring Westminster parliamentary democracy is really a pretty short list of things that need to change. But we need voters to be sufficiently informed. It's daunting, I'm going to admit this. I mean, it's 2013 now, and if the election is fall of 2015, but it could be fall of 2014, engaging enough Canadians to know that these issues matter and we're going to push all the parties to take a position on these issues before Election Day, and then we can hold them to their promises after Election Day. It's right now the only solution I can see to the problem is to make sure that Canadians know how significantly imperiled democracy is in this country. Yeah. Very next.
Welcome to Calgary, Miss May.
Thank you.
My name is Elaine Husband, and I'm very sick with Lyme disease. This very complicated and horrible bacteria infection is otherwise known as borreliosis. Ms. May, you will recall meeting me last fall when you kindly, excuse my emotions, agreed to personally hand deliver my letter to Member of Parliament Libby Davies in Ottawa. I wrote to Ms. Davies not only as Deputy Leader of the NDP official opposition, but also as the health critic for the New Democratic Party of Canada. Thank you for delivering that letter to her. I was very pleased to receive a handwritten response from Libby, assuring me that the NDP is giving full support to you and your private member's Bill number 442, which calls for a national Lyme disease strategy. I want you to know I've been working to get signatures on this important petition. I encourage everyone here tonight to sign that petition if they have not already done so, and I checked at the back and it's here. It might even be a good idea to be passing it around. My question is, whereas Parliament has been prorogued yet again, would you please clarify for me and others here tonight who have this debilitating disease, what is the status of your proposed Act of Parliament regarding Lyme disease? When can we expect it to come before the House of Commons for second reading?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Elaine. Then thank you for coming. Okay. The good news is that because private members' bills face a pretty upstream climb to get in position to get to second reading, a number of years ago, the rules were changed. Now, some of you may know that when the House prorogues, any bills on the order paper die and have to start over, and sometimes by unanimous consent, they can start over where they left off. But in the case of private members' bills, their position in the queue is unchanged by prorogation. So right now, when I first was elected, and this is, by the way, parliamentary arcane rules, but it's a lottery, by the way, whether your private member's bill is going to come up for a vote and when. So when you first get elected, they do a big lottery and you draw a number. I drew number 110, which meant my bill, whichever bill I chose to put up for a vote, and I've got quite a number of private members' bills that are all important, but I could pick one bill which come up for a vote in the 110th position. When we rose for the summer in June, my bill was number 4. That's how far we've progressed in the 2 years I've been serving. The bill is, knock on wood, largely and widely supported. As you've just mentioned, the NDP, Libby Davis, gave me a full commitment that all NDPers support it, all Liberals support it, but a ton of Conservatives have told me privately they want to vote for it too. So we really need to have nonpartisan support across the board. The bill calls, for those of you who don't know it, it's a national, it's provincial jurisdiction healthcare in a lot of ways, but this is a terrible disease. How many of you in this room already have friends or know people with Lyme disease? Yeah, a lot. It's spreading. It's related to the climate crisis, that as we get warmer temperatures, these ticks are spreading into areas where they didn't used to be. A lot of people end up with Lyme disease and end up being misdiagnosed, often diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, or diagnosed with fibromyalgia, or chronic fatigue syndrome, or any one of a number of conditions. If you get a correct diagnosis soon, the treatment is fantastic and you're completely restored to good health. As those of you with Lyme disease probably know, if you have a long delay, worst case, I've talked to so many people who went for years without knowing, it's very, very hard to be restored to perfect health. So the bill calls for 3 things. A meeting of the Federal Minister of Health with provincial and territorial colleagues, engaging the medical community, the community of people who are Lyme disease sufferers, and experts to do three things: to develop a national strategy for better awareness and prevention, a national strategy for better diagnosis, and sharing of best practices, because some provinces do a better job than others. And thirdly, more focus on research towards a cure. So that right now I'm feeling cautiously optimistic that when the bill comes up for second reading, we can get it passed, second reading, go to committee for study. Ronna Ambrose is the new Minister for Health, and she's an Albertan. Please do contact her. If you have friends in her riding in Edmonton, please encourage them to speak to her personally. This is a nonpartisan matter, and the petitions have been delivered to so many MPs through the House of Commons. Those petitions are very helpful. Don't send them to me. Send them to your own MP in Calgary, whoever he or she is, and if you get a chance to meet with them, to stress that this bill is the bill I'm putting forward to a vote. We're going to need their support, and we're going to need it soon. And please, God, we get it through.
Hi, Elizabeth. Fred Clemens. Just briefly, I'd like to know your opinion on mandatory voting, like to have in Peru.
Yeah, mandatory voting would be better than the system we have now. I prefer having a voting system that empowers people to feel their vote is going to count, so people vote because they want to, not because they don't want to be fined. But there are many countries around the world with mandatory voting where people are fined if they don't vote. One of my favorite parliamentarians, by the way, he passed away a couple years ago, but he served in the House of Commons for 32 years. His name was Charles Caccia. He was Minister of Environment under Trudeau. He was a wonderful Italian forester from Milan who'd come to, anyway, fantastic guy. Every year for 32 years, he put forward a private member's bill to call for mandatory voting, a fine if you didn't vote, and one small change to the ballot. Under the names of all the candidates, a box for none of the above. That was his little idea. No surprise it didn't pass. I mean, anything is better than the current system. By the way, let me just, since this is a town hall, how many of you think that you'd like to see, well, I'll do it in grades. How many would like to see the end of first past the post? Okay. How many of you think that if there was proportional representation, you prefer, and how many of you are familiar with different kinds of PR? How many prefer mixed member proportional? How many prefer STV? How many think we need to have a referendum before we make a change to get rid of first past the post? How many think that if I was Prime Minister, I could just do it on my own and pick whatever I like? Okay, so it's an interesting, and how many think that mandatory voting would be a good idea? Okay, this was another one that came up in my own riding a couple times. How many think that we should change our voting system so that we can have electronic voting and people don't have to actually go to a polling booth to change? Okay. It's just good to get your sense of it. I mean, so your question's next.
Oh, hi. My name's Erica. So my question is about omnibus bills, and it seems, I wonder how they achieved the enormous volumes that they have of late. I mean, the last one you mentioned was a 440-page document, and that seems to me, and I know you were one of the only few, you were one of maybe the only parliamentarians who took the time to read it.
I am the only MP who read the whole thing.
Right, and then there's this huge pressure to,
I hate to tell you that, because I know, because I'd go to Joe Oliver and Peter Kent and ask them about things in their speeches. And when I go to talk to them afterwards, I realize, okay, you haven't read it either. Okay, sorry, keep going.
So it seems that that's a really, I mean, that's politics in bad faith, right? Putting forth a document that's that many pages long, and then, you know, expressing your frustration when people are spending days discussing it. It seems that what are we in such a rush for? So I wonder. The deliberations obviously take time. Yeah. But so I wonder if you think there's any way of putting a limit on the amount of stuff one can shove into one omnibus bill, right. or if that's not inherently anti-democratic. What do you think we should do?
Thank you, because, okay, it's a complicated question because of parliamentary procedure, because the idea of an omnibus bill in and of itself is not offensive to me. Right? Why do we have omnibus bills when they are legitimate? And I made this argument to the Speaker on Bill C-38, and if people are interested in all the arcane precedents I found from previous Speakers' rulings, it's still on our website at elizabethmaymp.ca. But an omnibus bill is appropriate when you make one single change, say for instance NAFTA, it's one change but it was big, and it required that the Parliament of Canada amend a whole bunch of acts all at once to meet what had been passed by Parliament in NAFTA. Right? That was an omnibus. What Stephen Harper has perfected is an abusive process. And he didn't just start it when he got the majority. In 2007, I think, or was it 2009, the first of his big omnibus bills was passed by a minority parliament because the Liberals and the New Democrats, neither one of those parties was ready for an election, so they let it go by. That was the first time he started attacking the Navigable Waters Protection Act, and the omnibus bill was 700 pages long. The next one also made significant changes, changed the Environmental Assessment Act to get around some court decisions that said the Minister of Environment wasn't allowed to break up a project and only examine a road if it was really a road to a giant project. The most egregious ones are the ones people noticed once I was elected. So C-38, 440 pages long, changed 70 different laws. The thing that made it illegitimate as a piece of legislation was not that it was long, but that there was no single unifying decision, there was no theme to it, there was no policy to it. They tried to claim that it was implementing the budget, but in Budget 2012, they never mentioned in Budget 2012 dismantling the Fisheries Act. There was a mention of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, but there was no reference to getting, there was one reference in the budget to getting rid of the Canadian Roundtable on Environment and Economy. There was no reference in the budget to the Fisheries Act. It wasn't mentioned. So that's, I could go on and on, but the things that weren't mentioned in the budget that were in the omnibus budget bill, and then on the other hand, there were things in the budget that they claimed they were going to do that never got done in the omnibus budget bills, and there were things they said in their speeches in the House would be in the omnibus budget bill that weren't there. So it was, in every way you looked at it, this was an abusive process solely to put through an agenda that was offensive as quickly as possible. So for Budget 2012, there were 2 omnibus bills to the same, claiming they were putting in place a budget, which they weren't. So the first one was C-38 in spring of 2012, the second was C-45 in fall of 2012. Both of those bills, combined length about 900 pages, put the two together, no changes allowed. So what we really need to do, and the Speaker said in response to my point of order, that it wasn't for the Speaker to decide what the rules should be around when an omnibus bill is appropriate and when it isn't. So the Parliament should make those rules. The Liberals tried with an opposition motion last fall to argue that the House should in fact take it on in a committee to determine the rules around omnibus bills. The Conservatives were all instructed to vote that down, so it didn't pass. So I think the Speaker had it within his authorities to rule that that bill violated parliamentary tradition, but speakers aren't bound by precedent and you can't appeal their decisions. So it remains that the current situation is we can't get rid of omnibus bills, but we could, if we had enough MPs in the House of Commons committed to doing it, create the rules and the framework that keep them from becoming what C-38 and C-45 were, which were gross abuses of process. Thank you. Thank you, Erica. Oh, we're passing it here, then we're going to go back there. And by the way, we advertise this meeting is ending at 9. It's 5 to 9 now, so certainly all, what's Chantal? We have it at 9:30. We have it till 9:30, so I'm cool with that. I just thought I'd check. Good. Okay, we'll just keep going. If you have to leave, please wave to me as you go so I'll know it wasn't anything I said. Okay, so you go next.
So I've definitely heard what you said about the grassroots being an important part of pushing back, and I agree. But do you think that it's possible that this is a bell that can't be unrung in terms of the abuse of the Prime Minister's office? How much taste in the Liberal and the NDP party do you think they have? And do you think that it's worth looking at constitutional reform?
Well, the great news about the changes that I've talked about tonight, we've talked about the Senate a little bit. The Senate, fixing the Senate requires opening up the Constitution. Getting rid of the Prime Minister's office doesn't require anything more than everyone deciding this is an abomination, this is a cancerous growth on the body politic, and we're going to get rid of it. We could do that any minute, right? It's not in the Constitution. So that makes it, that's really encouraging, right? when you think about it, it's great news that we could abolish political parties. Let's think, if we're going to think outside the box, let's go for it. Let's just say every member of parliament represents their constituency. Now, over time, we'd probably end up having the same process happen, that people like to gather together and birds of a feather flock together, and then they all decide what their color is. But the essence of parliamentary democracy is that we are representing our constituents. And if we can reduce the powers of political parties, take away the leader's signature on the nomination papers, perhaps, restricting the operation of political parties between elections. We certainly shouldn't allow political parties to run televised ads when the writ period hasn't been, we're not in a writ period, and there's no control of spending of political parties on ads. So the powers of political parties need to be curtailed, and those powers are not protected under our Constitution because political parties aren't mentioned under the Constitution. So I think it's very fixable, and people in much worse fixes than us have emerged from totalitarian regimes much worse than, we use the term dictatorship for how Stephen Harper runs Canada. It's true, the term fits in the same way that Jeffrey Simpson wrote about Jean Chrétien, the benign dictatorship, a whole book about Jean Chrétien, in which he described the operation of Parliament as being like people orbiting around a sun king, right? So, this is not new, that if you have a prime minister with a majority government who is prepared to be ruthless, we don't have good protections against that. But we could, and certainly people in many, you can think of all the totalitarian, you can think about the Berlin Wall falling, you can think about Nelson Mandela in jail in apartheid South Africa. I mean, the challenges we face in Canada are as nothing compared to, think about the resistance fighters against Nazis in the Second World War. We don't really have good excuses for not being more active. Nobody's going to try to kill us. The main thing that people have to worry about is maybe losing their job. But in the scheme of things, and I can tell you right now in Ottawa, fear is a big factor in how Stephen Harper holds on to control. People in the civil service are afraid. I had one member of I used to be vice chair of the National Roundtable. And when they were abolishing the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy, and given that that body was a balancing of CEOs of industry, environmental activists, academics, people, union leaders, it was a mix. So I thought, well, I'm going to call the people who were on the roundtable over the years and see if they won't, in a nonpartisan way, go to bat for keeping the institution alive. And I spoke to one former industry CEO, who I think was a lifelong conservative, who said, I'm sorry, Elizabeth, I'd love to sign that letter. And as a Canadian, I never thought I'd hear myself say this, but I have 3 children working in the civil service, and I don't want them to lose their jobs. Now, that level of fear is extremely worrying, but what are we afraid of? If we can ask ourselves that question, we must not be afraid in a society which is inclusive. We still have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have the rights of free speech. We're not at risk. We can be much more active than we are. So when you ask the question, can we fix this? You bet we can. But the first thing we have to decide is we're going to try.
Hi, Elizabeth. I remember being at a conference, a panel discussion, environmental conference at Dalhousie campus about 5 years ago. You were on the panel. I had a question then, and I have a question now that's the same question, but I want to segue into that question with an agreement with your analysis. I do believe that democracy is flawed, but I don't think we need to save it, because I see it as bourgeois democracy. And I see a difference between bourgeois democracy that we see with the insistence of foisting upon people or nations the United Nations system of accounts, i.e. capitalist economics, and the Occupy people's democracy, or the students in Quebec democracy, people's democracy. I see that difference. I see fundamentally we could, if we wanted to save bourgeois democracy, we'd have to go back to actually saving the social contract, and that fell apart in the early 70s with the rise of, corporations, if you will. So my question back then was to the panelists, and a lot of them were biologists, physicists, whatever have you, and then you were there. You know, capitalism has the logic of a cancer cell. Is it time that we go beyond capitalism? And one by one, they were saying, like, you know, we're starting to realize that capitalism in our studies is going against the fundamental ideas of biology, the fundamental ideas of physics. And then we get to you, and you said, and I was cheering for you. I was hoping, they're like, yes, I imagine Elizabeth May being an anti-capitalist. And you said, I don't think it's about capitalism not working. It's about capitalism not working for us. Now, a lot of things have changed in the last 5 or 6 years. We now even, I grew up Catholic, I'm an atheist now, but we even have a pope that's anti-capitalist. He just came out and said, so I want to ask you again, do you think it is time that, because I believe, and a lot of people believe that capitalism has the logic of the cancer cell that will eat its host and leave everybody dead, do you think it's time to move on to something more like a people's democracy rather than a bourgeois democracy?
Okay, well, first of all, I think that the actual quote, certainly what David Suzuki has said, with which I agree, which is that endless economic growth as a goal is the ideology of a cancer cell. And I don't care if that economic growth is under a capitalist model, a communist model, a socialist model, or a community model. It doesn't matter. If your goal is unending expansion of the throughput of energy and raw materials to your society, then that's the ideology of a cancer cell. There are ways that one could have in a capitalist society that you change the corporate structure from the current limited corporation model to co-op models. I mean, Mountain Equipment Co-op is a member-owned co-op and makes a profit in a capitalist system. I don't think, and I know you're going to be disappointed that I don't think, and I mean, it's not a surprise the Pope is against capitalism. God knows Jesus was. Popes were supposed to be following in Jesus' footsteps, although it wasn't totally clear at all times. But it's not, the problem that we have, and I really love democracy, so that probably makes me bourgeois. And I believe that every healthy democracy we've ever seen, as a fundamental pillar of a healthy democracy, has been a healthy middle class, where people feel sufficiently secure that they're not fearful of the other, they don't think they're about to lose their job, lose their home, and have to block somebody else from access to what they have had. So societies that have functioned well have had strong labor unions, have had controls on abuse of whatever economic system they were in, have had regulations to prevent the worst offenses by those seeking to make profits, with an atmosphere that ennobled and emboldened those entrepreneurs who had a good idea to get it out there, to hire more people to make it happen. So I'm all keen on people making money on green technology, solar energy, wind power, clean tech, new forms of biofuels that don't come from food. There's a range of new technologies out there with a lot of people looking forward to making money. And the problem isn't, in this situation, capitalism. The problem is that we have a government structure that's favoring only one player and rigging the game in favor of fossil fuels through subsidies and barriers and so on. So I think we could actually have a steady state economy. Like, we'll be the only political party you'll ever hear talk about how there are limits to growth. We must not make economic growth and fall into the assumption that that's the only way to have a healthy economy. In fact, in the absence of a steady state economy, we're constantly exposed to the risks of a boom and bust cycle, to losing jobs, we've got to control the crazy people in casino capitalism, trading derivatives globally. We ought to have a Robin Hood tax, a Tobin tax. We need to put in place things that control the speculative economy that tries to make money out of nothing while risking the fortunes of real people in the process. That kind of capitalism is, in the meantime, you know, it would be, you know, if you can come up, as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government that's ever been tried except for all the others. If I could hear in the critique of, and I love the Occupy movement, but the thing is, I wish it had been better organized. That's the problem with an anarchic response to a top-down, totalitarian, multinational controlled system is that it actually can't provide a viable alternative to the non-viable reality in which we find ourselves. I think democracy can provide that, particularly when we want to see more people employed, and we want to see economic success, and we want to see more wealth created with a reduced throughput of energy and raw materials. So it's a longer answer than you probably wanted, and I'm sorry to disappoint you after 5 years, but sorry. You're next, and I think you might be with the Lyme disease folks because you've got a green ribbon.
That's me.
Yeah.
My name's LaDonna Tobin, and I'm here representing my sister and hundreds of others that are chronically ill and slowly dying from Lyme disease. My sister, this last year and a half, has been really sick with much of the symptoms that you mentioned: brain lesions, chronic fatigue, chronic pain, skin rashes, swelling, joint pain, whatnot. And unfortunately, in Canada, the medical system has diagnosed her as crazy, hypochondriac, needing antidepressants, and needing physio. It took us a long time, about a year, to figure out that she needs testing for Lyme. We heard through other people. She got tested in the States, the tests were negative in Canada. Again, gone through the same journey that many others have. Unfortunately, there is treatments, but they're expensive. And I think we're at the point of determining whether or not we sell our homes to save her life. We recently have joined together and formed Alberta Lyme Movement to try and raise awareness and also fight for proper diagnosis and treatment. I understand, and I've recently learned that you proposed the bill C-442, and I'm just wondering if you have any idea of when we will be able to get proper diagnosis and treatment, and what else there is we can do, and what I can do to help save my sister and many others.
It's for those of you who don't know this situation, this heart-wrenching tale is completely happening to. I mean, it's happening to so many people, and the stories are desperate. A lot of people are basically bankrupting themselves to go to the U.S. for treatment because the current treatment is massive amounts of antibiotics appear to have a good impact and restore people to health. I mean, I brought this bill forward because I had so many adolescents in my riding coming in to see me in wheelchairs, unable to go to school, and then having discovered that they had been bitten by a tick and had Lyme disease, even though they never got the bullseye rash, they didn't get all the things that they're told are typical. Even if you're thinking about Lyme disease, it's hard to get diagnosis. So all I can say is I'm working as hard as I can to get the bill in and through. You can help a lot. Everybody in Calgary, it's one of those things, it's the plus of living in Calgary. Every single one of you has a Conservative MP. It means, I know, you never thought it was a plus, huh? Yeah, well, okay. You can get petitions into your Conservative MPs, and particularly where you have any kind of personal relationship, someone that you can run into your MP locally, please tell them how much you will appreciate it if they vote for Bill C-442.
Hi, Elizabeth May. This is my first time out and actually seeing you live in person. I really wanted to come out to meet you live tonight. But yeah, as soon as I saw you, I was struck by something that absolutely baffled me. I see through my kind of lifetime and generation, I've always seen these leaders like presidents and prime ministers. They start off as these, dark-haired, brown-haired men, and then over time in their position, they become these very gray, old-looking men in a very short time span. You know what I mean? Like they transform, they become very white-haired and kind of paley looking. And yet you've been with us for so long and dealt with so much. You look fantastic.
That's hysterical. Well, darling, let me tell you.
You have a serious question as well as your spouse.
Well, it's very sweet. I'll tell you, it's actually kind of funny. I am the oldest of all the leaders. Yeah, I'm older than Stephen Harper. I'm older than Tom Mulcair. You won't be surprised I'm older than Justin. But yes, I'm just hoping to get in the leaders' debate, so if there's any questions from Stephen Harper about Justin's relative youth, I can point out that really I've never held it against him that he's too young. Yeah. So you have a real serious question.
I do.
What do you think is going to be the biggest factor for us to create change towards a sustainable, functional, educated society? What is the biggest factor?
We have to see ourselves as citizens in a democracy and reject the notions that we are consumers in an economy. And it may just be, the words have power and the words have meaning, and we have to reconnect our sense of self with empowerment, because the essence of consumerism is passive. And we are supposed to be passive. We are constantly bombarded with messages that are intended to anesthetize us and instill in us a collective amnesia, so that, like the proverbial frog in the pot of water, we don't notice that we've lost democracy. As long as we have our creature comforts, as long as how the heck did it happen that CBC News thinks it's the lead story when Apple comes up with a new device we're supposed to run out and buy? This is very odd stuff to me, because I've lived long enough to remember when the news was about events that shaped our future, not, what the latest new gizmo is that we have to run out and buy. So it's a cultural shift. It's going to be much more important than any one policy change. Now I think you're the youngest questioner tonight. Would you mind telling us your name and your age?
I'm Stefan, and I'm 10. I'm questioning on what are your views on the pros and cons of electronic voting? Like, I know how it's easier, but it's also easier to hack. So what are your views on that?
Stefan, before you leave the mic, what do you think?
I'm not sure. That's why I'm asking you.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure. That's why I was asking you. I'm very concerned about the potential for electronic voting machines that we know in the States. There are examples that have been documented of a software program that is already spiking the vote to go towards people who didn't get all those votes. So as long as there is a permanent record, some form of record that can be maintained as a paper system that backs up the electronic vote so that it's verifiable. If we had that, then I think it would work. And I think technologically we can pull it off. We trust a lot to electronics these days. People are prepared to do online banking. Now, it is true every now and then you can have identity theft. But anything that gets more people to vote, I think would be a good thing. So I'm largely because of people in my constituency who've been raising this issue in the town halls I've been holding, I think it'd be good. But let me ask you another idea, Stefan. One of the Green Party policies is that we should move the voting age from 18 to 16. What would you think of that? Do you think if people voted younger, they might vote more when they were 18 or 16? Going to go back, good. Man, I think in your case you should vote at 10, but
I'm not sure about that, because there's different views on, I think it would depend on the individual. So I think keeping it at 18 is a good idea, because there's some people who aren't ready to handle it at 16. Some people are, but it's just good to keep it at 18, which is a steady idea where they can handle voting.
Okay. Well, is that your son? Oh my God. I'm so very grateful to you for coming tonight. Everybody here is thinking that they wish they knew you better and that they would like to be able to boast, like, that's my grandson, but they can't. There's only some people in this room who can boast about you, but thank you for coming. Good questions.
Hi, my name is Leanne, and I'm a Lyme sufferer. I've been sick for 12 years, misdiagnosed. My son is 6, and he got it from birth. He also has autism as well. My question really to you, I mean, my story is not really all that interesting. It's like many others, lost my house, I'm paying for my own treatment. I have a PCR positive result, which is the genetic material of the bacteria in your blood from the US, from an hygienics lab in the US. The testing here in Canada leaves it negative for me. So there's a problem with testing when we only have that bacteria strain. There's only one bacteria strain that we test for, and there's multiple strains. When can we expect a better test here in Canada? My concern is not only for myself and my son, who we already know we have Lyme, but those that don't know they have Lyme. What about the Canadian blood supply? My real concern. You need 5 transfusions if you have a heart surgery. What about sexual transmission? What about the unborn child that gets it through the mom? Songbirds that we know biologists have detected it in their poop across Canada. This is an epidemic. It's the fastest growing infectious disease in Canada. And we need, as a medical profession, we need as Canadians to step forward and address this issue. It's an epidemic, and it scares me. It's really scary.
Well, it was interesting this summer, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, in the U.S., did a re-estimation of Lyme disease sufferers in the U.S., and they increased their estimate tenfold. They went from an assumption of 30,000 Lyme sufferers to 300,000. And in Canada, we have, I think from all the health professionals that I talk to who are concerned about this, we have dramatically underestimated the extent of the problem. All I can say is in the previous answers, a lot of it is provincial jurisdiction. If we can get a focus on it, if we can get this bill passed, it includes those 3 elements: better awareness for prevention, better treatments and sharing of best practices, and more research. And part of that, of course, is to get better testing. All I can do, I don't know any other mechanism right now that has a hope of doing this except my private member's bill. So I'm glad you guys raised it tonight, and please keep getting petitions into MPs.
There's 2 things. The Public Health Agency says that people with Lyme, we don't just rely on the testing, we rely on the symptoms. But yet I have not been able to get treatment, even 8 weeks of antibiotic IV treatment that I would need at least 8 weeks of treatment. So there's a gap, and there is a naivety in the medical system in terms of the needs around treatment of chronic Lyme disease.
Well, yeah.
The one point I want to also make is David Suzuki, our dear friend, is putting on a show on Thursday, this Thursday at 8 p.m., I believe it is, 6 or 8 p.m. on CBC, and it's on Lyme disease. So that should get us up to speed on what's happening.
Obviously, I don't know what he's going to say about it on the nature of things on October 10th, but I'm pretty excited that the focus nationally will be on Lyme disease, on the nature of things, on the eve of when I'm going to be taking my bill into the House for second reading. So that's good timing.
Go ahead, Troy.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, Troy. How you doing?
Good, thanks. My name is Troy Millington, and I have a question for you with respect to, you had alluded to the fact that you had tried previously to form coalition-type activities at the federal level to try and draw people together to look at the fact that there's a democratic deficit federally and it's getting worse. My question is, do you feel that a similar process is, I feel that a similar process is happening provincially, and I wonder to what extent do you think that a similar mechanism of cooperation might be effective in driving that at a provincial level, and what impact might that have federally as a result, as an example of how it could be changed?
Yeah, well, all of the voting, all of the jurisdictions in Canada, provincially, territorially, and federally, are stuck with first past the post, although none of it is an interesting example because they don't have political parties, so it's more like a municipal election. But for the most part, all of them suffer from the same levels of dysfunction, and any jurisdiction that manages to have a breakthrough that uses cooperation or finds ways to get rid of first past the post, it will be a great example to everybody else to follow that process. I didn't mention earlier that when I described how dangerous it is that so much power is gathered under the Prime Minister's office, you see this process replicated across the provinces as well, that a Premier's office is in charge of the whole show, and the ministers are less, I don't know if it's as bad in the provinces in terms of cabinet members having actually nothing to say about their own departments as much as it is in Ottawa right now. But it's a serious problem. And so what I'm seeing happening federally is replicated across the country. So if we have a solution that emerges provincially, others are likely to try to follow it in other jurisdictions, including federally. Yeah, we just have to try to, the current system is dysfunctional, so anything that breaks out of it is going to be very helpful. And did you have someone over there, Chantal?
Actually, I have my own question.
Oh, okay.
So, as some of you may know, I'm actually a huge advocate for Idle No More, and today is the National Day of Action for Idle No More. And my question has a lot to do with treaty rights. And we know that the current system, it was based on the Algonquin system of democracy. Now, where our dysfunction is that we're not observing those treaty rights. And we're actually trampling all over them within Parliament right now. And do you think by correcting our current democratic system that would actually bring it back to a session of respect for treaty rights?
Yeah. It could and it might not. It's not going to be the perfect solution to everything. In relation to treaty rights right now, and it hasn't come up in the conversation yet, but I want to thank the Hupakasat First Nation of Vancouver Island, which is 300 people near Port Alberni, who right now are the only ones standing up against the Canada-China investment treaty. If we're looking at the ultimate expression of an anti-democratic process where no MPs were consulted, no First Nations, I shouldn't say no MPs, I imagine that Ed Fast, as Minister of Trade, knew about it. But none of the other MPs were consulted or knew anything about the Canada-China investment treaty. And Stephen Harper signed it last September of 2012 in Vladivostok in Russia when he was there with President Hu of China for the APEC summit. It will not have a vote in the House of Commons. It can be ratified solely by Cabinet. It will be binding on all future governments of Canada for 31 years, and it will create the opportunity for the People's Republic of China and its state-owned enterprises, which are just branches of the Communist Party of China, to bring arbitration suits and seek damages from Canada if we change our laws in ways that the Chinese state-owned enterprises think will cost them money. So this is really dangerous stuff. And in relation to treaty rights, it's the Hupakasat First Nation who's saying, look, we weren't consulted, and this could affect our rights to traditional practices and our resources on our territory. It's interesting how often in these conflicts over resources, it's the First Nations who are stepping up. And by the way, the Hupakasat First Nation lost in the first round of hearings. The Government of Canada, the Justice Department lawyers requested of the judge and got it, a cost awards against this community of $100,000. Yeah, for 300 people who are saying, on behalf of, frankly, I think on behalf of all of us, this is a dangerous treaty. So the relationship issues are critical. They're complex because we're saying, at least Green Party policy is, that the relationship between the Government of Canada and First Nations governments should be on a government-to-government basis. On the other hand, yeah, well, it's what we should be. But the other issue is, and I was talking to some Idle No More, Maliseet, and Mi'kmaq women who came to my town hall in Fredericton, and they were saying, how do we get people in the First Nations communities to vote in the Canadian elections, because everybody's so certain that our votes and our governance system is separate. So we need to inspire engagement in the political process for First Nations people to vote in Government of Canada elections for MPs and MLAs, and their First Nation election, and that we relate to First Nations on a government-to-government, nation-to-nation basis. It's complicated, and the current system works in opposition to that, despite all the court decisions that have been rendered that say there's a fiduciary responsibility on the part of the federal government of Canada to consult meaningfully with First Nations before taking decisions that affect their territories. We're really failing badly on almost every metric one can think of Canada's relations to First Nations. So thanks for raising it, Chantal.
I just want to make a quick mention. The Hupakath First Nation really does need our help. You can go through the Council of Canadians website.
Or Lead Now.
Or Lead Now as well, and donate to them and for their cause.
And they're also, my office in BC, we've been working, I think basically I did the outreach to everybody I could think of to ask them to go to court. I called every provincial premier. I talked to lots of First Nations, and the Hupakath First Nations were the people who stepped up, which was pretty incredible considering there's only 300 of them. So we've been working really closely. So I think you're next.
Thank you. My name is Grant Canning. I've been very fortunate to hear you speak a number of times at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities conference. And at that conference, all the leaders of the major parties all tend to come and they do their speeches. And the thing that struck me about you numerous times over the past few years is you don't rely on notes. You don't rely on teleprompters and things like that. You've always been very genuine and very honest with your remarks. And I can't honestly say that about the other leaders who very much rely on notes in front of them and set speeches for that matter. So I think that's a real credit to you and your ability to public speak. As I'm sure everyone...
Well, thank you, Brent.
As I'm sure everyone here knows, in 2 weeks we have a municipal election coming up, and obviously not just in Calgary, but all across the province, where all the municipalities are going to the polls. And I really do believe that everyone who puts their name on a ballot in any election it's really about trying to make their communities better, right, and being involved in their communities. And there's literally hundreds and hundreds of people across this province who are doing just that. And I give them a lot of credit for having the courage, quite frankly, to put their name on that ballot. My question to you is what advice would you give for someone who is interested in running for public office, whether it be federally, provincially, or municipally?
The advice is simple: do it. There's the first time, the idea of running, you think, oh, I can't do it because I've got this, that, and the other reason. If you're interested in participating in the life of your democracy, the more people who do it who are not motivated. Now, I've got to say, I agree with you entirely. The members of Parliament with whom I serve are like 95% some of the nicest people you'd ever want to meet. They all have, regardless of party, something in their background that made them feel brave enough, committed to public service enough to put their name on a ballot and put yourself out there. It's the first time you do it. It's pretty weird. It can be quite intimidating. So there's no way to really prepare for it. Well, you can join up and work on. You can help another candidate in their campaign. You can go door to door helping somebody else. But when push comes to shove, getting up and running yourself, whether municipally, provincially, or federally, just do it.
Hi. Thanks for being here and sharing your knowledge, wisdom, and energy. My name is Donna Ingerson. I'm with the Council of Canadians, and my question is related to our municipal election. Question is, what is the CETA's finalization looking like? That's a comprehensive economic and trade agreement with Europe, the first international trade agreement that's going to impact provincial and municipal governments, where they can do what corporations can sue us, whatever, pharmaceuticals are at risk. What stage of approval is it at? And what advice do you have as municipal voters in looking at our aldermanic candidates and looking at CETA?
Well, this is a great chance. Any election is a good chance to raise awareness about these treaties. It's actually, Donna, not the first. NAFTA, Chapter 11, allows U.S. or Mexican corporations to sue the Canadian federal government for decisions made at municipal, provincial, or federal level. So does, the most dangerous of these so far is the Canada-China Investment Treaty, which would give the People's Republic of China the ability to bring suits against Canada for decisions made municipally, provincially, federally, or through court decisions if the People's Republic of China decides that its state-owned enterprises, whether CNOOC that now owns Nexen, or Sinopec, or PetroChina, or any one of them. There's Sinoforest that was now found guilty of securities fraud in Ontario, but there have been a lot of Chinese state-owned enterprises investing in Canada. Now, to move on to some good news, CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement, has not yet concluded negotiations. Canada's comments publicly, Stephen Harper's comments publicly, have sounded increasingly desperate. Increasingly as though we got to get a deal, or it's, the time in which, and certainly a lot of the pro-trade negotiators and pro-trade cheerleaders are sounding discouraged. So now, if they do conclude the agreement, and there are threats to supply management, the pharmaceutical drug companies will do well, and we'll have higher drug prices. There's a lot of reasons, and it includes the investment treaty provisions we were just talking about. But the process of ratifying a treaty with the European Union is fantastic. I don't think it'll ever happen. The reason it has to pass the European Parliament and each of the individual parliaments of each of the European Union nations. Now, this is one of those places where we have a lot of elected Greens. And they tell me they think there'd be a very serious challenge to it in the European Parliament. Why would there be a challenge to a trade treaty with Canada in the European Parliament? Well, because we pulled out of Kyoto, because there's a lot of European parliamentarians mad at Canada, because there's a range of issues where we've alienated other countries. And then of course there's the question on each individual country. They'll see themselves at risk as well. So we'll see how it goes. I'm not sanguine about it. We have to be aware of it. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think, is a bigger risk because the ratification in the Trans-Pacific region doesn't include this double layer. European Union is the only trade bloc, because backing up and saying essentially every trade agreement between nations involves a reduction of sovereignty. Every trade agreement is saying, okay, our domestic laws are going to be constrained to the extent that we agree to work with you. You're going to constrain yours a bit, but we're doing it because we want a trade bloc. European Union is quite extraordinary. It's the only place in the world where in deciding to go together for a trading bloc, they recognized the loss of sovereignty and created a new democratic institution to help keep an eye on that. Because the European Parliament is essentially a governance structure for a trading bloc. Interesting. If we'd done that in Canada, US, and Mexico, imagine if we'd had a North American Parliament where we tried to keep an eye on the excesses of NAFTA, the maquiladora areas, the pressure on Mexico to reduce health and safety standards, pressures on Canada to reduce environmental laws. We did not create a democratically elected umbrella structure. Now, of course, we would have been swamped by the population in the US. But it is interesting that the European Union created a parliament and it also has a lot more equal players. Germany, France, England, economies of some real clout. Never mind that they were at war with each other not long ago. But they were able to do this in the interest of good governance and a better democracy. And so I think that's, we sometimes are against, some people, like NAFTA is, I think, a terrible document. But it's not enough to be against trade. It's the kind of structure. And if NAFTA had been more like the European Parliament, which insisted that every country in the EU meet the highest environmental standards of any country in the EU. It led overall to a raising of standards, whereas so many trade blocs lead to a reduction of standards. So in terms of what do you do in a municipal election, ask every municipal councillor if they've looked at the Canada-China Investment Treaty and considered what they will do as Calgary aldermen and council members to do everything possible to stop the ratification of an agreement that will mean that the People's Republic of China and its state-owned enterprises will have more to say over the future municipal decisions of this community than the people who live here and vote. So, you've been extremely patient, those of you, I mean, even those who left were patient, but it's been a really great opportunity to talk to you. I'm very grateful. Realdemocracy.ca is a website that we've set up to continue this kind of conversation. vraidemocracy.ca. Be very grateful to have your continued input, help, advice, because saving democracy isn't one party's job, and it's not one leader of one party's job, as I think you probably are pretty clear by now. We're going to need everybody, and frankly, from now on, I'm putting Stefan in charge. I think that's you're okay. You're our leader now, and I will be looking for instructions. Thank you very much for coming out tonight.